Have you ever tried to explain yourself to someone who had already decided not to believe you? You laid it all out, the reasons, the context, the evidence. You explained and explained, watching their face stay exactly the same, unmoved, unconvinced, sometimes even amused by how hard you were trying. And somewhere in that moment, something in you quietly broke, just a little. Not because they doubted you, because you realized, for the first time, how much of your energy you'd been spending trying to be understood by people who were never actually listening. Here is a truth that takes most people decades to learn, if they ever learn it at all. Explaining yourself to someone who's determined not to understand is not communication. It's a performance for an audience that already knows how the show ends. And every minute you spend performing it is a minute stolen from the one thing that could have actually changed their mind, or better yet, made their opinion irrelevant altogether: your results. This is the story of what happens when you stop defending yourself in words and start letting your life speak for you instead. It's not always comfortable, it's not always fast, but it is, I promise you, one of the most quietly powerful shifts a person can make. Before we begin, if this is already striking a nerve, do one small thing: hit subscribe. Not for me, for the version of you that's about to stop explaining and start building. Let's begin. Chapter 1: The exhausting habit of proving yourself. There is a specific kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with physical exertion and everything to do with a particular, draining habit so common that most people never even notice they're doing it: the habit of constantly explaining, justifying, and defending yourself to people who have already made up their minds. Think about how often this actually happens in an ordinary life. A family member questions a decision you've already thought through carefully, and instead of simply stating it once, you find yourself building an elaborate case, anticipating objections, offering evidence, circling back to add one more justification, as though enough words might finally land. A colleague doubts your competence, and rather than letting your actual work speak, you find yourself narrating your effort, your intentions, your reasoning, hoping that if you just explain thoroughly enough, the doubt will dissolve. A critic online questions your choices, and you type out a response, delete it, type it again, refine it, because some part of you believes that the right combination of words might finally, this time, make them understand. I want to name something important right at the start of this journey. This habit is not a character flaw, and it doesn't mean you're insecure or weak. It comes from something deeply human and, in most contexts, genuinely useful: the desire to be understood, to be seen accurately, to correct a misperception before it hardens into something false and permanent. In many situations, explaining yourself is exactly the right thing to do. This journey is not an argument against communication or against ever offering context or reasoning to people who are genuinely open to hearing it. But there's a specific, narrower situation this journey is going to focus on closely, because it's where this habit becomes genuinely costly rather than useful. The situation where you are explaining yourself over and over to someone who has already, clearly, decided what they believe, and no amount of explanation is actually going to move them. In this specific situation, continued explaining isn't communication anymore. It's a kind of quiet, exhausting performance offered to an audience that stopped watching a long time ago. Let me tell you about a woman named Perpetua. Different context from an earlier journey, worth hearing fresh. Perpetua left a stable, respectable career in her early 30s to pursue something considerably riskier and less immediately comprehensible to the people around her. The reaction from her extended family was not hostile exactly, but it was persistently, relentlessly skeptical. Every family gathering bringing another round of questions, another round of gentle but pointed doubt about whether she'd made a foolish decision. For the first 2 years, Perpetua responded to this skepticism the way most people instinctively do, she explained. She laid out her reasoning at length, walked through her financial planning, described her research, offered evidence of early progress, anticipated objections before they were even raised. She left every family gathering feeling drained in a way that had nothing to do with the actual conversation, and everything to do with the sheer, repeated effort of trying to make people understand something they had already decided before she opened her mouth. that they weren't going to understand. What Perpetua eventually noticed, with a kind of quiet, dawning clarity, was that her explanations were not actually working. Not once, in 2 full years of detailed justification, had a single skeptical family member said, "Oh, now I understand. That makes complete sense." The explanations weren't landing because they were never really about information in the first place. Her family's doubt wasn't a data problem, solvable with better evidence. It was a comfort problem, an unfamiliar choice, made by someone they loved, that didn't fit their existing picture of how a sensible life was supposed to look. No amount of explaining was going to change that discomfort, because the discomfort had never actually been about the specific facts Perpetua kept offering. This is worth understanding deeply, because it's the psychological key to this entire journey. When someone's doubt is rooted in genuine unfamiliarity with your evidence or reasoning, explanation can genuinely help. It gives them something they were missing, and once they have it, their view often does shift. But when someone's doubt is rooted in something else entirely, their own discomfort with change, their own investment in a particular story about you, their own unexamined assumptions about what a good life looks like, explanation doesn't touch the actual source of the doubt at all. You can hand someone a mountain of accurate, well-reasoned information, and if the doubt was never actually about information, the mountain simply sits there, unexamined, while they nod politely and continue believing exactly what they believed before you started talking. The turning point for Perpetua came, somewhat unexpectedly, at a family dinner where a relative raised the familiar, skeptical question one more time, and Perpetua, for the first time, simply said, calmly and without elaboration, "It's going well. I'm happy with it," and stopped. No lengthy justification, no anticipatory defense against objections that hadn't even been raised yet. Just a short, true statement, followed by silence, followed by a change of subject. She described the moment afterward as strange and almost frightening. The old instinct to keep explaining rose up powerfully, insisting that she needed to say more, that stopping here would leave people with the wrong impression, that silence would be read as evidence she had nothing to offer. But she held the silence anyway, and something unexpected happened. The conversation simply moved on. No one pressed further. The sky did not fall, and Perpetua noticed, with real surprise, that she left that particular dinner without the familiar, bone-deep exhaustion that used to follow every one of these conversations. I want to draw out what actually happened in that moment, because it contains the central insight of this entire journey. Perpetua's family's doubt had never required a longer explanation to be satisfied. It required either a change of heart on their part, which was not within Perpetua's control, or the passage of time and visible results, which would speak more persuasively than any explanation ever could. What the longer explanations had actually been doing, all along, was not convincing anyone. They had been managing Perpetua's own discomfort with being doubted, a discomfort that felt, in the moment, like it demanded more words, when in fact, it required something much harder and much more effective: the willingness to simply let the doubt exist, unresolved, without chasing it down with one more attempt at persuasion. This is worth sitting with directly, because it reframes something most people never examine: the compulsive urge to keep explaining yourself, past the point where explanation could plausibly help, is very often not actually about the other person at all. It's about your own discomfort with being misunderstood, doubted, or disapproved of, a discomfort so uncomfortable that your mind reaches, automatically, for the nearest available action that feels like it's doing something about it. Talking more feels like progress. It feels like taking control of the situation. But when the doubt was never rooted in missing information, talking more is not actually progress. It's simply a way of discharging your own anxious energy into a conversation that was never going to be resolved by more words in the first place. Here is what I want you to carry forward from this first chapter, because everything else in this journey builds on it. Not every doubt is an invitation to explain, and not every explanation actually serves the purpose you think it does. Before your next instinct to justify yourself at length, it's worth pausing to ask a simple, clarifying question. Is this person's doubt actually rooted in missing information, or is it rooted in something explanation was never going to touch? The answer to that question changes everything about what you do next. And it's the question this entire journey is going to keep returning to, again and again, as we explore what becomes possible once you finally learn to let some doubts simply exist, unchased, while you turn your actual energy towards something far more persuasive than any explanation could ever be, what you actually go on to build. In the next chapter, we're going to look more closely at exactly why explanation so often fails to change a mind that's already made up, and the specific psychological reason your results will always be a more powerful argument than your words. Chapter 2. Why words rarely change a mind that's already decided. There is a specific, well-documented quirk of human psychology worth understanding clearly, because it explains something that confuses and frustrates almost everyone at some point. Why perfectly reasonable, well-evidenced explanations so often fail to change someone's opinion of you, even when your reasoning is genuinely sound and your evidence is genuinely solid. Here's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath this pattern. Human beings do not primarily form opinions about other people through careful, rational evaluation of evidence, updated smoothly whenever new information arrives. They form opinions through a messier, more emotional process, shaped by first impressions, by existing beliefs about how the world works, by their own comfort or discomfort with what a given choice represents, and only afterward, if at all, do they reach for reasoning to justify a conclusion that emotional and social factors had already substantially settled. This isn't a flaw unique to any particular person you might be dealing with. It's simply how human cognition tends to work, verified repeatedly across decades of psychological research. People are far better at rationalizing conclusions they've already reached than they are at rationally arriving at conclusions from a neutral starting point. This matters enormously for understanding why explanation so often fails. When you offer someone a careful, reasoned explanation, you are implicitly assuming their doubt was produced by a lack of information, and that supplying the missing information will resolve it. But if their doubt was actually produced by something else, discomfort with an unfamiliar choice, a competing belief about how life is supposed to work, simple unfamiliarity with people who've made a choice like yours, then your careful explanation is answering a question they were never actually asking. You're filling in a gap that was never actually empty. Let me tell you about a man named Aldrich, whose experience with this dynamic offers a clear illustration. Aldrich worked in a field where a particular unconventional approach he'd developed produced consistently strong results, but ran counter to the conventional wisdom most of his colleagues had been trained in for years. When Aldrich first began sharing his approach with more senior colleagues, expecting genuine curiosity given the strength of his results, he was met, instead, with a specific and consistent kind of resistance. Not outright hostility, but a polite, persistent skepticism that no amount of explanation seemed able to touch. For months, Aldrich responded to this skepticism the way most capable, conscientious people instinctively do. He built increasingly detailed, increasingly rigorous explanations of his methodology, anticipating every possible objection, preparing data to counter every likely doubt. And the skepticism, frustratingly, barely moved. Colleagues would nod politely through his careful explanations and then, in the very next conversation, raise the exact same doubts, as though the explanation had never happened at all. What Aldrich eventually came to understand, through a conversation with a mentor who had watched this exact pattern play out many times before, was that his colleagues' skepticism had very little to do with the specific technical merits of his approach, and a great deal to do with something else entirely. His approach implicitly suggested that methods they had spent years mastering, methods central to their own professional identity and expertise, might not be the only, or even the best, way forward. This is not a comfortable thing for anyone to sit with, and it produces a specific, predictable defensive reaction. Not necessarily conscious dishonesty, but a genuine, largely unconscious motivation to find reasons the new approach couldn't really be as good as it appeared, because accepting that it might be threatened, something more personal than simple professional disagreement. Once Aldrich understood this, his careful, detailed explanations made a lot more sense, as a strategy that had never really had a chance of working. He wasn't dealing with a missing information problem. He was dealing with an identity threat problem, and no quantity of data, however rigorously presented, was going to resolve a threat to identity through purely rational argument, because the resistance had never actually been rational in the first place. It simply wore the clothing of rational objection, while its actual roots lay somewhere more emotional and more personal. This insight changed Aldrich's entire strategy, and it points toward the central shift this whole journey is building toward. Instead of continuing to build ever more elaborate explanations, hoping that the right combination of words might finally overcome an emotional resistance that words were never actually equipped to address, Aldrich shifted his energy almost entirely towards simply continuing his work and letting the accumulating results speak for themselves. He stopped trying to convince skeptical colleagues through argument. He kept working, kept producing results, and let time and outcome do what explanation never could. This shift matters because of something important about how results function differently from explanation in overcoming this particular kind of resistance. An explanation asks someone to trust your reasoning, which requires them to lower a defense they may have significant unconscious motivation to keep raised. A result doesn't ask for trust in the same way. It simply exists, observable, and increasingly difficult to argue with, regardless of whether the observer wants to believe it or not. Aldrich's colleagues could dismiss his explanations relatively easily, because dismissing an argument requires only finding some objection, however minor, to hold on to. Dismissing a consistent accumulating pattern of superior results is considerably harder, because eventually the sheer weight of observable outcome becomes more uncomfortable to deny than to simply, quietly, begin acknowledging. Over the following 2 years, without any further attempt at persuasive explanation, Aldrich's results continued accumulating, consistently and visibly. And something gradual, almost imperceptible at first, began happening among his previously skeptical colleagues. Not a sudden dramatic conversion, but a slow, quiet softening, individual colleagues beginning, without much comment, to adopt pieces of his approach themselves. The skepticism fading, not because anyone had ever been persuaded by an argument, but because the accumulated evidence of outcome had simply become harder to keep arguing with than to quietly, without ceremony, begin incorporating. I want to draw out something important here about why this matters for you specifically, in whatever situation brought you to this particular journey. If you find yourself in a pattern of repeated, increasingly elaborate explanation, met each time with persistent, unmoved skepticism, it's worth considering honestly whether you're actually dealing with a missing information problem, solvable through better explanation, or an identity threat, comfort, or emotional investment problem, which explanation was never actually going to solve, no matter how skillfully or thoroughly you deliver it. This distinction changes everything about where you should actually be spending your limited energy. I want to be careful here, because this is not an argument that explanation is always useless, or that you should stop communicating your reasoning to people entirely. There are genuinely many situations where someone's doubt really is rooted in missing information, and a clear, honest explanation genuinely resolves it, often quickly and completely. The skill this journey is building is not never explain. It's the far more useful and more discerning skill of recognizing, as early as possible, which kind of doubt you're actually facing, and directing your energy accordingly, rather than defaulting automatically to more explanation regardless of whether explanation was ever going to be the thing that worked. Here is what I want you to carry forward from this chapter. When explanation repeatedly fails to move someone's opinion of you, the problem is very often not that your explanation wasn't good enough. It's that you were solving the wrong problem entirely, offering information to resolve a doubt that was never actually about information in the first place. In these specific situations, your results, patiently accumulated and simply allowed to exist, will do work that no explanation, however careful or however often repeated, was ever actually capable of doing. In the next chapter, we're going to look at something that makes this shift genuinely difficult in practice. The specific, uncomfortable feeling of being misunderstood while staying silent, and how to tolerate that discomfort long enough for your results to actually speak. Chapter 3. Sitting with being misunderstood. There is a particular discomfort that arrives the moment you decide to stop explaining yourself to someone who's already decided not to believe you. And I want to name it directly, because pretending this shift is easy would do you a disservice right at the point in this journey where honesty matters most. The discomfort is this: when you stop explaining, you have to actually sit with being misunderstood, sometimes for a considerable stretch of time, without the temporary relief that comes from at least trying to correct the misunderstanding. This is genuinely uncomfortable, and it activates something old and deep in human psychology. The same social wiring, in fact, that we've touched on in other contexts throughout different journeys. The ancient fear of being seen inaccurately by a group whose good opinion once meant real safety. Choosing silence over explanation means choosing to let that discomfort exist, unresolved, rather than reaching for the quick, familiar relief of trying, one more time, to set the record straight. I want to be honest about why this matters so much, because underestimating this discomfort is exactly what causes most people to abandon this practice within days of trying it. The compulsive urge to explain doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from a genuine, uncomfortable feeling. Being misunderstood produces something close to a low-grade alarm in the nervous system, a sense that something is wrong and needs to be corrected immediately. Sitting with that alarm, rather than immediately acting on it, requires a specific kind of tolerance that most people have simply never had to practice, because the instinct to explain has always felt like the obvious, natural response. Let me tell you about a woman named Bridget, whose experience illustrates both the difficulty and the eventual reward of building this particular tolerance. Bridget made a significant, unconventional decision in her personal life, one that a specific, vocal subset of her social circle interpreted, incorrectly but persistently, in an unflattering light. For a period of several months, she found herself the subject of a specific, recurring misunderstanding, repeated in slightly different forms by different people, none of whom she felt she could realistically explain herself to individually, without the explanation looking, itself, like defensive over-justification. Bridget's first instinct, understandably, was the familiar one: correct the record, explain the actual situation clearly, make sure everyone understood the truth. But she found, in this particular case, that the misunderstanding was distributed across enough people and rooted deeply enough in their own existing assumptions that no single explanation, or even several, seemed capable of actually reaching everyone or actually changing the underlying narrative that had taken hold. She was left with a genuinely uncomfortable choice: continue an exhausting, probably futile campaign of ongoing explanation, or simply let the misunderstanding exist, unaddressed, while she continued living her actual life. She chose, with real difficulty and real ongoing discomfort, the second option. And she described the following months as some of the hardest of her adult life, not because anything dramatic happened, but because of the specific, grinding discomfort of knowing that people held an inaccurate picture of her, and choosing, deliberately, not to chase down every opportunity to correct it. She described specific moments of real pain, overhearing a second-hand version of the misunderstanding, repeated by someone she cared about, feeling the powerful urge to interject and correct it, and instead, with real effort, staying silent and letting the moment pass. I want to name something important about what Bridget was actually building during this period, because it's easy to describe simply as tolerating discomfort in a way that undersells what's actually happening. What she was building, specifically, was a kind of psychological independence from other people's immediate perception of her, a genuine internal stability that didn't require everyone around her, at all times, to hold an accurate picture of who she was and what she'd actually done. This is different from not caring what people think, which would be neither realistic nor entirely healthy. It's something more precise, caring what people think, while also being able to survive, intact, periods where they think something inaccurate, without that inaccuracy destabilizing her own sense of herself. This distinction matters enormously, because it points toward what actually needs to be built in order to sustain this practice long-term. If your sense of your own worth or reality depends entirely on other people's accurate perception of you at all times, sitting with misunderstanding will be nearly unbearable, and you'll find yourself pulled back, again and again, toward compulsive explanation, regardless of how well you understand, intellectually, that the explanation isn't actually working. But if you can build even a modest degree of internal stability, a private, settled knowledge of your own actual truth, independent of whether a particular person currently, temporarily, sees it accurately, the discomfort of being misunderstood becomes something you can genuinely tolerate, rather than something that demands immediate, compulsive correction. Bridget developed a specific private practice during this period that she found genuinely helpful, worth naming directly because it's replicable. Whenever the urge to explain rose powerfully, in a moment where she'd already determined explanation wouldn't actually help, she would pause and silently remind herself of a simple, private truth. I know what actually happened. That knowledge doesn't depend on whether they know it too. This might sound almost too simple to matter, but the mechanism behind it is worth understanding. It shifted the location of her sense of truth from something that needed external, social confirmation to something that could exist, complete and stable, entirely within her own private knowledge, a truth that didn't need anyone else's belief in order to remain fully, genuinely true. Over the following year, without any further attempt at active correction, the specific misunderstanding surrounding Bridget gradually faded, not because anyone delivered a decisive, convincing explanation, but because her actual, ongoing life simply continued demonstrating something different from the narrative that had briefly taken hold, and people, over time, quietly updated their picture of her based on what they continued to observe, long after they'd forgotten the specific rumor or misunderstanding that had briefly shaped their initial impression. I want to be honest about something important here, because this chapter would be incomplete without acknowledging a real limit. There are situations where a misunderstanding is serious enough or consequential enough that active correction genuinely is necessary, regardless of the discomfort involved. Situations involving your safety, your legal standing, or genuinely severe reputational harm that could affect your livelihood or well-being. This chapter is not arguing that you should always, in every circumstance, simply absorb misunderstandings silently. The skill being built here is discernment, once again, recognizing which misunderstandings genuinely require active correction, and which ones, left alone, will resolve themselves more effectively through the simple, patient passage of time and continued living than through any amount of your own anxious, repeated explanation. Here is a practice worth carrying forward from Bridget's experience, one you can use the next time the urge to compulsively explain yourself arises in a situation you've already recognized explanation won't actually resolve. Pause and silently remind yourself of your own private, settled knowledge of the truth, not requiring anyone else's immediate belief in order for that truth to remain fully real. Let the discomfort of being misunderstood exist, without immediately reaching for words to resolve it. And trust, as difficult as this trust can be to hold in the moment, that your continued, actual living, rather than your continued explaining, is doing the real work of eventually, patiently, correcting whatever inaccurate picture currently exists. In the next chapter, we're going to look at what actually happens, specifically and mechanically, when results are finally given the chance to do the persuading that words never could, and why the timing and manner of that eventual proof matters more than most people realize. Chapter 4. What happens when you finally let results speak? There is a particular moment worth examining closely, because it rarely gets the attention it deserves in most conversations about self-belief and resilience. The specific moment when a person, after a long stretch of unheard explanation, finally stops talking and simply lets their accumulated work exist in front of other people, unaccompanied by any further justification. I want to walk through, carefully, what actually happens in that moment, psychologically, socially, and practically, because understanding the mechanics makes the whole practice considerably easier to trust. Here is the first thing worth understanding. Results, unlike explanations, cannot be argued with in the same way. When you offer someone a reasoned justification for a decision, you're offering them something abstract, words describing a reality they haven't directly observed. And anything abstract can be countered with other abstractions, a different interpretation, a competing piece of reasoning, a simple refusal to be persuaded. But a completed project, a visibly transformed circumstance, a track record accumulated over time. These are not abstractions. They are directly observable facts, sitting in the world, requiring no interpretation to register their basic existence. A person can dispute your reasoning. It is considerably harder to dispute that something you said you would build has in fact been built. Let me tell you about a man named Osric, whose experience illustrates this shift with real clarity. Osric had spent years working in a field where his unconventional path, self-taught rather than formally credentialed, generated persistent, if usually polite, skepticism from more traditionally trained peers. Early in his career, he responded to this skepticism the way this journey has already examined, with elaborate, careful explanation, defending the validity of his unconventional training, anticipating every objection, hoping the right words might finally settle the question. The shift for Osric came gradually, once he had accumulated enough completed, visible work that the work itself became available as evidence in a way it hadn't been available in his earlier years. He described a specific moment at a professional gathering where a colleague who had been quietly skeptical of him for years finally, almost offhandedly, referenced a piece of Osric's completed work with clear, genuine respect. Not because Osric had ever successfully explained his way past that colleague's skepticism, but because the colleague had, over time, simply encountered enough of Osric's actual output to update his own opinion, entirely independent of anything Osric had ever said in his own defense. This is worth naming precisely, because it reveals something important about how results actually persuade, differently from how explanation attempts to. Explanation asks someone to change their mind through argument, a process that requires them to actively engage with your reasoning, evaluate it fairly, and consciously update their view, all of which requires a level of good faith openness that skeptical people, for whatever reason, are often not currently offering. Results don't require any of that active engagement. They simply exist, and over time, a person's mind updates almost passively, absorbing the accumulated evidence of what they've actually observed, often without any single dramatic moment of conscious reconsideration. Osric's colleague hadn't been argued into a new opinion. He had simply, gradually, run out of reasons to hold on to the old one, because the observable evidence in front of him had quietly outpaced it. I want to draw out something important about the specific quality results have that explanation lacks. Results carry no defensiveness. When you explain yourself, even calmly and reasonably, there's often an implicit undertone the listener can sense, whether or not you intended, a hint of please believe me, a faint current of needing their agreement in order to feel settled. This undertone, subtle as it is, can actually work against you, because people are remarkably sensitive to the difference between someone speaking from genuine confidence and someone speaking from a need to be validated. Results carry none of this undertone at all. A finished project doesn't need anyone's belief in order to exist. It simply sits there, complete, entirely indifferent to whether the observer approves of it. And this indifference, paradoxically, often makes it considerably more persuasive than the most careful, well-intentioned explanation ever manages to be. There's a specific practical implication worth drawing from this, because it changes how you might think about where to actually invest your limited time and energy when facing skepticism. Rather than dividing your energy between doing the actual work and defending the work verbally to doubters, this journey is suggesting something more concentrated. Direct nearly all of that energy toward the actual work itself, trusting that its eventual, accumulated existence will do more persuading than an equivalent amount of energy spent on verbal defense ever could. This isn't a claim that explanation is always worthless. As established earlier in this journey, there are genuine situations where clear communication helps enormously. It's a claim, specifically, about situations of persistent, unmoved skepticism. In these particular situations, the highest leverage use of your limited time is very rarely more explanation. It's more building. I want to be honest about something important regarding timing, because this chapter would be incomplete without acknowledging a real difficulty. Results take time to accumulate, and during that accumulation period, the discomfort of ongoing doubt, discussed in the previous chapter, doesn't simply disappear. Osric's shift from persistent skepticism to quiet respect took years, not weeks, And during those years, he had to tolerate real, ongoing discomfort without the relief of any dramatic, decisive moment of vindication. This journey isn't offering you a shortcut around that difficulty. It's offering you a clearer, more accurate map of where the actual path leads, so that the difficulty, when it arrives, feels like an expected part of a real process, rather than evidence that the whole approach has somehow failed. There's a related insight worth naming here, one Osric discovered specifically through his own experience. Results don't just persuade skeptics eventually, they change your own relationship to the skepticism while you're still in the middle of enduring it. Once Osric had genuinely committed to letting his work speak, rather than continuing to argue verbally, something shifted in how the ongoing doubt actually felt to carry. It became lighter, somehow, even before any external vindication had arrived, because he was no longer spending his own limited emotional energy on a battle he had already recognized, correctly, as unwinnable through words alone. The doubt was still present, but it no longer felt like something he was actively, exhaustingly fighting on a daily basis. It felt instead like something he was simply outlasting, patiently, while his actual energy went somewhere far more productive. I want to offer a specific, practical distinction worth carrying forward from this chapter, one that will help you apply this idea concretely in your own situation. When facing persistent skepticism about something you're building or pursuing, ask yourself honestly, if I stopped explaining entirely, right now, and simply redirected all of that explanatory energy into the actual work, what would that redirected energy actually produce over the coming months that continued explanation never could? This question tends to reveal something important, that the energy currently going into verbal defense is often energy that could be producing exactly the kind of accumulated result that would do far more persuading, far more efficiently, than any amount of continued argument ever manages to achieve. Here is what I want you to carry forward from this chapter. Results persuade differently than explanation does, and often more effectively, precisely because they require no active goodwill or engagement from the skeptic in order to do their work. They simply exist, accumulate, and, over time, quietly outpace whatever doubt initially met them, not through confrontation, but through simple, patient, undeniable presence. This process takes real time, and it requires tolerating real discomfort along the way, exactly as the previous chapter described. But it is, in the end, considerably more reliable and considerably less exhausting to sustain than the endless, largely unsuccessful project of trying to argue a determined skeptic into a different opinion. In the next chapter, we're going to look at a related and equally important dimension of this practice, how to actually handle the specific moment when someone who doubted you finally does come around, and why your response in that exact moment matters more than you might expect. Chapter 5. How you handle vindication matters more than you think. There is a moment that, if you follow the path this journey has been describing, will very likely arrive eventually. The moment when someone who doubted you, sometimes for years, finally, quietly, comes around. And I want to spend this chapter on something rarely discussed in conversations about resilience and self-belief. How you actually handle that specific moment matters enormously, both for your own continued growth and for the relationship with the person who's finally coming around. The instinct when vindication finally arrives is often powerful and understandable. A part of you wants to point, directly and pointedly, at the doubt that was finally proven wrong. See, I told you. You didn't believe me, and look what I did anyway. This instinct comes from a genuinely human place. Years of accumulated frustration, finally given a legitimate outlet, wanting some acknowledgement of the vindication that's been earned through real, sustained effort. I want to take this instinct seriously, rather than simply dismissing it, because the desire for acknowledgement after a long period of doubt is not petty or small. It's a completely reasonable human response to a genuinely difficult experience. But I want to offer you something important to consider before acting on that instinct, because how you handle this specific moment shapes something significant about your continued relationship, both to the specific person who doubted you and to your own broader practice of letting results do the speaking, moving forward. Let me tell you about a woman named Cordelia, whose handling of this exact moment offers real insight into why restraint here matters. Cordelia had faced years of quiet but persistent doubt from a former colleague about a significant professional pivot she'd made. Doubt that had never been resolved through explanation, exactly as this journey has described, but that eventually, gradually, softened as Cordelia's accumulated results became increasingly difficult to ignore. The specific moment of vindication arrived when this former colleague, at a professional event, approached Cordelia directly and offered, with visible discomfort, something close to an acknowledgement. Not a full apology, not an explicit admission of having been wrong, but a clear, if understated, gesture of respect for what Cordelia had actually built. In that moment, Cordelia felt the full pull of the instinct described above. A real, powerful urge to remind this colleague, pointedly, of exactly how skeptical they had once been, to extract some more complete, more satisfying acknowledgement of having been wrong. She didn't do it. Instead, she simply said, warmly and without any edge of vindication, something close to, "Thank you, that means a lot," and let the moment pass without further comment. She described the choice, afterward, as one of the harder things she'd done in the entire process. Harder, in some ways, than the years of tolerating the original doubt, because the temptation to finally claim the victory she felt she'd earned was so immediate and so strong in that specific moment. I want to explain why this restraint mattered, because it points towards something important about what this entire practice is actually building in you, beyond simply the external outcome of being proven right. If Cordelia had used that moment to point out her former colleague's earlier doubt, she would have been, in a real sense, reverting back to exactly the dynamic this entire journey has been moving away from, making her own sense of vindication dependent on the other person's explicit, verbal acknowledgement of having been wrong. This would have undone, in that single moment, much of the genuine internal independence she'd spent years building, the capacity to know her own worth and her own results clearly, without requiring external confirmation, in order for that knowledge to feel complete. There's a deeper insight here worth drawing out carefully. The entire practice this journey has been describing, letting results speak instead of continuing to argue, only fully works if your own sense of accomplishment doesn't ultimately depend on the doubters, eventually, explicitly admitting they were wrong. If it does depend on that, you're still, in a real sense, orienting your own satisfaction around other people's opinions, simply hoping for a delayed, eventual version of the validation you originally wanted immediately. Genuine freedom from this dynamic means your satisfaction in what you've built stands complete on its own, regardless of whether any particular doubter ever offers explicit acknowledgement at all, which means that when acknowledgement does arrive, as it did for Cordelia, you can receive it graciously, as a pleasant but ultimately unnecessary addition, rather than as the finally arrived proof you'd been secretly waiting for the entire time. I want to be honest about something important here, because this level of genuine indifference to eventual vindication is difficult to reach, and it's worth naming that difficulty directly, rather than implying it should feel simple. Cordelia herself described years of continued, internal work before she reached the point where she could receive that specific moment of acknowledgement with genuine grace, rather than barely suppressed vindication. This isn't a switch you flip once and then have permanently mastered. It's a capacity built gradually, the same way every other skill explored throughout this journey has been built, through repeated practice, repeated choice, repeated small moments of choosing grace over pointed vindication, until the graceful response starts to feel more natural than the pointed one. There's a practical, relational reason this restraint matters as well, beyond its role in your own internal growth. When someone finally comes around to acknowledging your results, after a period of doubt, pointing out their earlier skepticism tends to produce a specific, predictable defensive reaction, even in someone genuinely, sincerely trying to offer respect. No one enjoys being reminded, pointedly, of having been wrong, even when they know, on some level, that they were. This defensive reaction, triggered unnecessarily, often actually damages the very relationship repair that the moment of acknowledgement was offering, turning what could have been a genuine, warm reconnection into something the other person quietly resents having offered at all, souring exactly the outcome you might have hoped this vindication would produce. Cordelia's graceful handling of that specific moment, by contrast, actually deepened her relationship with her former colleague in the months that followed. Freed from any defensive discomfort about having been reminded of past doubt, the colleague became, gradually, a genuine source of professional support and connection, something that likely wouldn't have happened had Cordelia used the moment to claim the pointed victory her earlier instinct had wanted. I want to offer a specific practice worth carrying forward from this chapter, one you can use when your own eventual moment of vindication arrives, as it likely will if you sustain this practice long enough. In that moment, notice the instinct to point out the earlier doubt and let it exist without acting on it. Offer, instead, a simple, warm acknowledgement of whatever respect or recognition is being extended, without editorial commentary on how long it took to arrive. Trust that your own private, internal knowledge of everything you built during the period of doubt is already, on its own, sufficient, and that this specific moment of external acknowledgement, however satisfying, is simply a pleasant addition to an internal sense of accomplishment that was never actually dependent on it in the first place. Here is what I want you to carry forward from this chapter. How you handle the moment of eventual vindication reveals and further shapes whether you've genuinely internalized the deeper lesson this journey has been building toward, or whether you've simply been waiting this entire time for a delayed version of the validation you originally wanted. Handle that moment with grace rather than pointed vindication, and you'll find that both your own continued growth and your relationships with the people who eventually come around benefit considerably more than the momentary satisfaction of a pointed "I told you so" could ever provide. In the next chapter, we're going to look at a related and important complication: what to do when results, despite your patient, sustained effort, don't actually arrive on the timeline you hoped, and how to sustain this practice even through periods of genuine, prolonged difficulty or apparent failure. Chapter 6. When the results are slow to arrive. There is a difficult question worth asking directly, because everything explored so far in this journey has assumed something that doesn't always hold true. What happens when you stop explaining, redirect your energy toward the work, and the results, despite genuine, sustained effort, simply don't arrive on anything close to the timeline you'd hoped for? What happens when patience stretches far longer than you expected, and the doubters, watching that stretch, seem to feel increasingly, rather than decreasingly, confirmed in their original skepticism? I want to address this directly and honestly, because a journey that only works when things go reasonably well isn't actually a durable framework. It's simply optimism dressed up as wisdom, useful only in the easy cases, and abandoned the moment things get genuinely hard. This chapter is specifically for the harder cases, because they are common, and because pretending otherwise would leave you unprepared for exactly the moment this practice is most needed. Here's the honest truth worth sitting with. Results do not arrive on a guaranteed timeline, and the strategy of letting your work speak instead of continuing to argue does not eliminate the real possibility of prolonged difficulty, setbacks, or stretches where progress feels genuinely, painfully slow. What this journey has been building is not a guarantee that patience will always be rewarded quickly. It's a framework for how to spend your limited energy wisely, regardless of the timeline. Because even in a slow, difficult stretch, the choice between continuing to argue with doubters and continuing to build remains largely the same choice, and building, even slowly, generally remains the better use of that limited energy. Let me tell you about a man named Thibaut, whose experience with a genuinely difficult, extended stretch illustrates how to sustain this practice even when results are slow to arrive. Thibaut pursued a significant, long-term goal that, by its very nature, required years of sustained effort before any conclusive results could reasonably be expected. The kind of undertaking where meaningful outcomes simply couldn't be rushed, regardless of effort or talent. During the early years of this pursuit, skepticism from people around him was, in a sense, entirely reasonable. There genuinely wasn't yet enough visible progress to counter it with, and Thibaut found himself in the genuinely uncomfortable position of having committed to letting results speak, while having, for a considerable stretch, remarkably few results yet available to actually do the speaking. This period tested Thibault's commitment to the entire framework far more severely than an easier, faster resolving situation would have. He described specific, difficult stretches where the temptation to return to explanation felt almost overwhelming, not because explanation would have actually helped, which he still, intellectually, understood it wouldn't, but because the sheer discomfort of prolonged, unresolved doubt, combined with the absence of any visible progress to point to even privately, created a kind of psychological pressure that made silence feel considerably harder to sustain than it had in easier, shorter-term situations. What helped Thibault continue through this genuinely difficult extended period was a specific reframe worth carrying forward directly. He began distinguishing clearly between two different things that could easily be confused in a difficult stretch: the absence of external, visible results and the absence of actual progress. These are not the same thing, even though prolonged difficulty makes them feel identical. Thibault's early years, though producing little that was externally visible or persuasive to skeptics, were nonetheless producing real, substantive progress, skills being built, foundational work being laid, groundwork without which the eventual visible results could never have been possible. This progress simply wasn't yet in a form that could persuade anyone watching from the outside, because it hadn't yet crossed the threshold into visible, demonstrable outcome. This distinction matters enormously for anyone in a genuinely slow, difficult stretch of their own. If you can honestly verify that real progress is happening, even if that progress remains invisible to outside observers for now, the absence of external validation doesn't actually indicate that anything has gone wrong with your approach. It indicates, simply, that you're in an earlier stage of a process that, by its own nature, doesn't produce visible results quickly, which is different, in an important way, from a situation where genuine progress has actually stalled and the approach itself may need honest reconsideration. I want to name this second possibility directly, because pretending it never applies would be dishonest and could genuinely harm you if followed uncritically. Sometimes, prolonged absence of results is not simply a matter of an inherently slow process requiring patience. Sometimes, it's a genuine signal that something about the approach needs to change, a signal worth taking seriously rather than dismissing purely as doubt-worthy impatience. The skill worth building here is honest, periodic self-assessment. Are you continuing to make real, substantive progress, even if invisible to others, or has progress genuinely stalled in a way that deserves honest reconsideration of your approach, separate entirely from the question of how skeptics are currently reacting to your lack of visible results? Thibault built a specific practice to help him make this distinction honestly, one worth carrying forward directly, periodically, at defined intervals rather than only during moments of acute doubt or discouragement. He would sit down and honestly assess, in concrete, specific terms, what actual progress had occurred since the last assessment, not measured against what skeptics might find persuasive, but measured against his own honest understanding of what the underlying work actually required. This gave him something more reliable than either blind optimism or reactive discouragement to work from, an honest, periodic accounting of whether the invisible, unglamorous groundwork was actually accumulating or whether it had genuinely stalled in a way that deserved real reconsideration. I want to offer something important about how to relate to doubters, specifically during this kind of genuinely slow, difficult stretch, because the dynamics discussed in earlier chapters of this journey become considerably harder to sustain when there's little visible progress yet available to eventually vindicate you. Thibault found that during this period, the practice of simply not engaging in extended verbal defense mattered even more than it had during easier stretches. Not because the doubt hurt less during this period, but because engaging with it verbally, during a stretch with genuinely little external evidence to offer in response, tended to produce even more exhausting, even less productive exchanges than it would have during an easier period. Silence, uncomfortable as it remained, protected his limited energy more effectively during the hard stretch than it had, even during the easier ones. There's a related insight worth naming here, one that connects back to an idea explored in an earlier journey about the importance of purpose, independent of external validation. Thibault's ability to sustain this genuinely difficult period rested heavily on a clear, private sense of why the work mattered to him, separate entirely from whether it was currently producing results that skeptics would find persuasive. This internal clarity of purpose functioned as a kind of anchor during the stretch where external validation simply wasn't available yet, something he could return to repeatedly that didn't depend on the timeline of results actually arriving on any particular schedule. I want to be honest, once more, about an important limit here, because this chapter, like others in this journey, would be incomplete without it. If a genuinely honest periodic assessment reveals that progress actually has stalled, not simply that visible results haven't yet arrived, but that the underlying work itself isn't actually advancing, that's a signal worth taking seriously and worth potentially involving a trusted, capable outside perspective to help evaluate honestly, separate from the noise of casual doubters who may not actually have the expertise to offer a genuinely useful assessment. Sustaining a difficult, unproductive path indefinitely, purely out of stubborn commitment to letting results eventually speak, is not what this journey is actually recommending. The recommendation is patient persistence, specifically where genuine, if invisible, progress continues to occur, not blind persistence, regardless of whether the underlying reality actually supports it. Here is what I want you to carry forward from this chapter. When results are slow to arrive, the crucial distinction to make, honestly and periodically, is between an absence of visible external results and an absence of actual underlying progress. These are frequently confused during a difficult stretch, but they are not the same thing, and confusing them either leads to unnecessary discouragement during a genuinely slow but healthy process, or to unproductive persistence in a genuinely stalled one. Build the honest, periodic self-assessment practice that lets you tell the difference, hold on to a clear sense of purpose, independent of external timeline, and trust that even invisible progress, honestly verified, is still progress worth continuing to build toward, regardless of how long the doubters have to wait before your results finally become visible enough to speak for themselves. In the next chapter, we're going to look at something closely related: how to actually protect your own motivation and self-belief during these difficult, slow stretches, when even your own internal confidence starts to waver alongside everyone else's doubt. Chapter 7. When even you start to doubt yourself. There is a specific, particularly difficult moment worth naming honestly, because everything explored in this journey so far has largely assumed a kind of stable, internal confidence that simply needs protecting from other people's doubt. But there's a harder version of this challenge worth addressing directly. What happens when the doubt isn't just coming from the outside anymore? When your own internal confidence, worn down by a genuinely long, difficult stretch, starts to waver too, and you find yourself, quietly and uncomfortably, agreeing with the skeptics you've spent so long trying not to be swayed by. I want to name this moment directly because it's one of the hardest and most common experiences in any sustained, difficult pursuit. And pretending it doesn't happen, or that this journey's earlier chapters simply solve it through sheer force of internal stability, would leave you unprepared for something you're very likely to encounter if you sustain any genuinely difficult effort for long enough. Here's what's worth understanding about this specific kind of self-doubt. It tends to arrive not from a single dramatic moment, but from the slow, cumulative erosion produced by a genuinely long stretch of sustained effort, without clear external confirmation that the effort is actually working. This erosion is different, in an important way, from the healthy, periodic self-assessment discussed in the previous chapter. Healthy assessment asks, clearly and specifically, whether actual progress is occurring. The erosion being described here is something more diffuse and less precise, a general, pervasive weariness that starts to color everything, making even genuinely solid evidence of progress feel unconvincing, simply because the sheer duration of the difficult stretch has worn down your capacity to trust your own judgment at all. Let me tell you about a woman named Zenobia, whose experience with this specific kind of erosion illustrates both its difficulty and a path through it. Zenobia had sustained a genuinely difficult, multi-year pursuit, tolerating persistent external skepticism, largely successfully for the first several years, exactly the way the earlier chapters of this journey have described. But somewhere in her fourth year, something shifted in a way that surprised her. She began to notice a specific, unfamiliar quality to her own internal state, not the confident, if uncomfortable tolerance of external doubt she'd successfully maintained for years, but something closer to a genuine, internal agreement with that doubt, as though her own resolve had finally, quietly, begun to crack under the accumulated weight of sustained difficulty. This is worth understanding as a distinct phenomenon from ordinary discouragement, because it requires a somewhat different response. Ordinary discouragement, addressed in earlier journeys, responds reasonably well to reconnecting with purpose, taking small concrete steps, and separating fact from the exaggerated stories the mind builds on top of setbacks. But the specific erosion Zenobia experienced went deeper than ordinary discouragement. It had begun to affect her actual capacity to trust her own perception and judgment, making it genuinely difficult for her to distinguish, in the moment, between legitimate internal doubt worth taking seriously and simple, accumulated exhaustion masquerading as clear-eyed reassessment. What helped Zenobia navigate this specific, difficult period was something worth naming directly, because it offers a genuinely useful practice for this exact situation. She began, deliberately, distrusting her own in-the-moment judgment during periods of acute exhaustion, and instead relying on decisions and commitments she had made earlier, during periods when her judgment had been clearer and less worn down. Specifically, she returned to written records from earlier, more confident periods, her own private documentation of why the pursuit mattered to her, what progress had actually been achieved, what her own honest assessment of the work's viability had been during clearer-headed moments. Rather than trusting her exhausted, eroded present-moment judgment as the most accurate available perspective, she deliberately treated her earlier, less worn-down judgment as more reliable evidence of the actual situation, precisely because exhaustion, she came to understand, distorts judgment in a specific, predictable direction toward excessive doubt and discouragement, in a way that clearer, earlier assessment simply hadn't been distorted. This is a genuinely important and somewhat counterintuitive insight worth carrying forward. During periods of significant accumulated exhaustion, your present moment self-doubt is not necessarily more accurate or more honest than your earlier, clearer-headed confidence. It's simply louder in that specific moment, because exhaustion amplifies doubt and discouragement disproportionately, regardless of what the underlying, actual evidence supports. Treating exhausted, in-the-moment self-doubt as automatically more truthful than earlier, more grounded assessment is a mistake that can cause someone to abandon genuinely sound, viable efforts simply because they happen to reach a point of significant accumulated tiredness, rather than because anything about the underlying reality had actually changed. I want to offer a specific, practical tool worth carrying forward from Zenobia's experience. Build, deliberately, a private record during periods of relative clarity and confidence, documenting honestly why your effort matters, what progress has actually occurred, what your genuine, considered assessment of viability looks like when you're not exhausted. Return to this record specifically during periods of acute, accumulated self-doubt, treating it as more reliable evidence of your actual situation than your current, worn-down, in-the-moment perception. This isn't about ignoring genuine, legitimate reassessment. As established in the previous chapter, honest periodic evaluation remains important. It's about recognizing that acute exhaustion is not the ideal state from which to conduct that evaluation, and that a decision to abandon or fundamentally reconsider a sustained effort deserves to be made from relative clarity, rather than from the specific, distorted vantage point of accumulated, temporary depletion. There's a related practice worth naming here, one Zenobia found genuinely helpful during this specific stretch. Rather than facing this internal erosion entirely alone, she allowed herself, for the first time in years, to bring this specific difficulty to a small, carefully chosen circle of trusted people, not to seek their validation of her external results, which remained, at this point, still limited, but specifically to voice the internal experience of eroding self-belief and to be met with genuine, grounded reassurance from people who knew her well enough to offer perspective her own exhausted judgment couldn't currently access. This connects directly back to an important idea from an earlier journey: the difference between structured, deliberately chosen support and casual, premature sharing with an undifferentiated audience. Zenobia wasn't broadcasting her doubt widely, hoping for general reassurance from anyone available. She was bringing it, specifically and deliberately, to the small number of people whose judgment she genuinely trusted, precisely because her own judgment, in this specific period, had become temporarily unreliable. I want to be honest about something important as this chapter closes. This specific kind of accumulated internal erosion, when it arrives, does not resolve quickly or easily, and Zenobia's own path through it took real time, months, not days, of deliberately returning to earlier, clearer records, deliberately leaning on trusted support, deliberately distrusting her own most exhausted, most discouraged in-the-moment assessments. But it did resolve, gradually, as the accumulated exhaustion eased and her own capacity for clear judgment slowly returned, restoring her ability to trust her own perception again, rather than needing to rely so heavily on external anchors and earlier records. Here is what I want you to carry forward from this chapter. If you find yourself, during a genuinely long and difficult stretch, beginning to internally agree with the doubt you've spent so long resisting from the outside, understand this as a distinct, specific phenomenon: the erosion of judgment produced by accumulated exhaustion, rather than necessarily an accurate, clear-eyed reassessment of your actual situation. Build, in advance if you can, a private record of your clearer-headed confidence and progress to return to during these periods. Allow yourself trusted, deliberately chosen support specifically for this internal experience, and trust that even this specific, difficult erosion, real and painful as it is while you're inside it, tends to ease with time, restoring your capacity for clear judgment, rather than representing a permanent, accurate verdict on the viability of what you're building. In the next chapter, we're going to look at something slightly different but closely related: how to handle the specific, complicated situation of doubt that comes not from strangers or casual acquaintances, but from the people closest to you, whose opinion you genuinely, deeply care about. Chapter 8. When the doubt comes from someone you love. There is a specific, harder version of everything explored so far in this journey, and I want to address it directly, because the practices described up to this point become considerably more complicated when the doubt in question isn't coming from a casual acquaintance or a distant colleague, but from someone whose opinion you genuinely deeply care about: a partner, a parent, a close friend, someone whose relationship with you matters far too much to simply write off with the same clean, protective detachment that works reasonably well with more distant skeptics. I want to name honestly why this situation is genuinely more difficult, because pretending the earlier chapters apply equally, without modification, to this specific circumstance would be dishonest. When a stranger or distant colleague doubts you, the emotional stakes, while real, are generally contained. Their opinion matters to a degree, but rarely does it touch the deepest, most vulnerable parts of your sense of being loved and accepted. When someone you love doubts you, especially persistently, the situation activates something considerably deeper, not simply a disagreement about facts or reasoning, but a more fundamental question that can feel genuinely threatening. Does this person, whose love and acceptance matter enormously to me, actually believe in who I am and what I'm capable of? Let me tell you about a man named Percival, no relation to the man of the same era-appropriate name mentioned in an earlier journey, but a distinct story worth hearing on its own terms. Percival's father had, for years, expressed persistent, unmoved doubt about a significant life direction Percival had chosen. Doubt that, unlike the more distant skepticism explored in earlier chapters, arrived wrapped in genuine parental concern, making it considerably harder to simply set aside as something not worth engaging with. Percival's early attempts to navigate this followed a familiar but ultimately unsuccessful pattern: extensive explanation, offered repeatedly, hoping that enough careful reasoning might finally earn his father's genuine belief in him, And exactly as this journey has explored in earlier chapters, the explanation didn't work, not because Percival's reasoning was flawed, but because his father's doubt, upon honest examination, wasn't actually rooted in missing information at all. It was rooted in his father's own genuine fear for Percival's well-being, shaped by his father's own history and his own limited understanding of what Percival's chosen path could actually look like when it succeeded. Precisely the dynamic explored in an earlier journey about the doubt of people who should believe in you but, for their own understandable reasons, sometimes don't. What made Percival's situation more difficult than the more distant examples explored earlier in this journey was the genuine impossibility of simply detaching from his father's opinion the way one might detach from a distant colleague's. Percival loved his father, genuinely wanted his father's pride and approval, and found the strategy of simply, coolly letting results speak considerably harder to sustain when the person waiting to be convinced was someone whose approval he'd wanted his entire life, in a far deeper and more foundational way than he wanted any colleagues or acquaintances. The path Percival eventually found, through real difficulty and real ongoing discomfort, involved a specific, important modification to the practices explored earlier in this journey, a modification worth understanding carefully because it applies to anyone facing this harder, more personal version of the challenge. Rather than choosing between the two options explored so far, continuing exhausting, unsuccessful explanation or fully detached silence, Percival found a middle path more suited to the genuine emotional stakes of a close, loving relationship. He stopped trying to convince his father through argument about the specific decision, while remaining genuinely, warmly present and connected with his father in every other dimension of their relationship, allowing the specific disagreement to exist as one honest, acknowledged difference within an otherwise full, continuing relationship, rather than either constantly relitigating it or coldly withdrawing from his father more broadly because of it. This distinction matters enormously, and it's worth drawing out precisely because it addresses something the earlier chapters, focused more on distant skepticism, didn't fully cover. With a distant skeptic, minimal engagement genuinely serves you well. There's little relational cost to simply redirecting your energy elsewhere. With someone you love, however, minimizing engagement with the specific point of disagreement, while maintaining full, genuine warmth and connection everywhere else, becomes the more sustainable and more relationally healthy path. Percival continued calling his father regularly, continued genuinely enjoying their relationship in every dimension unrelated to the specific disagreement, and simply, gently, declined to re-engage the argument itself whenever his father raised it. Not through cold withdrawal, but through warm, consistent redirection. I know you're worried, and I love you for it. I'm not going to convince you today, and that's okay. Tell me about your week. This specific approach, warm redirection rather than either continued argument or cold detachment, allowed Percival to protect his own energy from an unwinnable, exhausting verbal battle, while still honoring the genuine depth and importance of his relationship with his father. It didn't resolve the underlying disagreement quickly, but it allowed the relationship itself to remain genuinely warm and connected throughout a period that could easily have become bitter and estranged had Percival either continued relentlessly arguing his case or coldly withdrawn from his father in frustration. I want to name something important about the eventual outcome, because it illustrates how the core lesson of this entire journey, letting results speak, applies even in this more emotionally complicated, relationally embedded situation. Over several years, Percival's chosen path did, gradually, produce visible, accumulating results, exactly as the earlier chapters of this journey would predict. And his father's doubt, unmoved by years of earlier explanation, did eventually soften, not through any dramatic conversation, but through the same quiet, gradual process of accumulated evidence explored in earlier chapters, made considerably more meaningful, in this case, by the fact that the relationship itself had remained warm and intact throughout the entire process, rather than being damaged or embittered by years of futile argument. I want to offer something important here about a specific emotional difficulty worth naming honestly. Even after his father's doubt eventually softened, Percival described a lingering, genuine grief about the years his father had spent doubting him, a grief that the eventual softening didn't fully resolve. This is worth naming directly, because it would be dishonest to suggest that eventual vindication, even handled gracefully as described in an earlier chapter, fully erases the real, accumulated pain of having been doubted, for years, by someone whose belief mattered enormously. Percival's genuine, ongoing task, even after the external situation improved, involved processing this grief honestly, rather than simply moving past it as though it hadn't mattered. A task this journey has touched on in earlier chapters regarding the importance of genuinely feeling difficult emotions, rather than bypassing them in the name of forward progress. I want to offer a specific, practical framework worth carrying forward from Percival's experience, one that applies directly to anyone facing persistent doubt from someone they love. First, distinguish clearly between the specific point of disagreement and the broader relationship. The two do not have to be identical, and treating a single disagreement as though it defines the entire relationship often causes more damage than the disagreement itself. Second, practice warm redirection rather than either continued argument or cold withdrawal when the specific point of doubt arises, acknowledging the other person's concern with genuine warmth, declining to relitigate it further, and steering the conversation back toward genuine connection. Third, allow your results, over time, to do the work that argument couldn't, exactly as described in earlier chapters, while trusting that a relationship maintained with genuine warmth throughout that waiting period will generally emerge stronger than one damaged by years of futile, repeated argument. And finally, allow yourself to process, honestly, any grief that remains even after eventual vindication arrives, because loving someone whose doubt genuinely hurt you and holding real gratitude for their eventual change of heart are not mutually exclusive experiences, and both deserve honest acknowledgement rather than being flattened into a simple, tidy resolution. Here is what I want you to carry forward from this chapter. When doubt comes from someone you love, the clean detachment that serves you reasonably well with distant skeptics requires real modification. Protect your own energy from unwinnable argument, exactly as this journey has described throughout, but do so through warm redirection rather than cold withdrawal, keeping the relationship itself genuinely alive and connected, even while declining to continue relitigating the specific disagreement. Trust your results to eventually do the persuading, as they generally will. And when that eventual softening arrives, allow yourself both genuine gratitude for it and honest space for whatever grief remains from the years of doubt that came before it. In the next chapter, we're going to look at something that becomes especially important once you've built real skill in this practice: how to avoid the specific trap of becoming someone who refuses all feedback, mistaking every piece of input, even genuinely useful input, for the same kind of unproductive doubt this journey has been teaching you to set aside. Chapter 9. Not all feedback is doubt to be ignored. There is a specific trap worth naming directly at this point in the journey, because everything explored so far, if misapplied, could tip into something genuinely harmful to your own growth. The trap of becoming someone who has learned to dismiss all external input, treating every piece of feedback, criticism, or concern as simply more unproductive doubt, to be quietly set aside while you continue, unchanged, toward your existing goal. I want to address this directly, because it's a genuine risk in taking the lessons of this journey too far, too indiscriminately. Everything explored so far has been about a specific, narrower situation, doubt that's rooted not in genuine information you're missing, but in something explanation was never actually going to touch: discomfort with unfamiliarity, unconscious identity threat, simple lack of exposure to what your particular path can actually look like when it succeeds. But not all doubt fits this description. Some feedback, even feedback that arrives sounding remarkably similar to the unproductive doubt explored throughout this journey, actually contains genuinely useful information, insight you're genuinely missing, blind spots you genuinely can't see from inside your own perspective, legitimate concerns that deserve real consideration rather than confident dismissal. Learning to distinguish between these two categories, unproductive doubt, worth setting aside in favor of continued building, and genuinely useful feedback, worth taking seriously and potentially acting on, is one of the more difficult and more important skills this entire journey has been building toward, and I want to address it directly and honestly in this chapter, because getting this distinction wrong in either direction carries real costs. Let me tell you about a woman named Rosalind, a different Rosalind from any mentioned in earlier journeys, whose experience illustrates why this distinction matters so much in practice. Rosalind had internalized, genuinely and thoroughly, much of what this journey has explored: the importance of not over-explaining herself to unmoved skeptics, the value of letting her results accumulate and speak for themselves rather than constantly defending her choices verbally. This served her well for a real stretch of time in exactly the situations this journey has described: persistent, unproductive doubt from people whose skepticism was never actually going to be resolved through argument. But Rosalind, having built real skill and real confidence in setting aside this kind of unproductive doubt, began, gradually, to apply the same dismissive stance to a different, more dangerous category of input: genuine, well-informed feedback from people with real expertise and real insight into specific, correctable problems in her approach. When a mentor, someone with genuine, relevant experience and no particular investment in doubting her simply out of discomfort with her unconventional path, raised a specific, well-reasoned concern about a flaw in her current strategy, Rosalind, by this point deeply practiced in setting aside doubt without extensive engagement, found herself reflexively categorizing this feedback the same way she'd learned to categorize unproductive skepticism, something to be politely acknowledged and then set aside, trusting that her continued work would eventually prove the concern unfounded. This turned out to be a genuine mistake and a costly one. The mentor's concern, unlike the unproductive doubt explored throughout most of this journey, was rooted in genuine, specific expertise Rosalind actually lacked, a real, correctable flaw in her approach that, left unaddressed, eventually produced exactly the kind of setback the mentor had warned about, a setback that could have been avoided entirely had Rosalind actually engaged seriously with the feedback, rather than filing it under the same category as the unproductive doubt she'd learned, correctly in other contexts, to set aside. This is worth understanding as a genuinely important corrective to everything explored so far in this journey, because the skill being built here was never meant to be ignore all external input. It was always meant to be something more precise and more discerning, distinguish accurately between doubt that's rooted in something explanation can't touch, and feedback that's rooted in genuine information or expertise you're actually missing, and respond to each category appropriately, rather than developing a single blanket response applied indiscriminately to anything that sounds, on the surface, like doubt or criticism. I want to offer some specific, practical markers worth using to make this distinction, because just tell the difference isn't actually useful guidance without more concrete tools to work with. Consider first the source. Does this person have genuine, relevant expertise or direct experience with the specific thing you're doing, or is their doubt rooted primarily in general unfamiliarity with your particular path? A mentor with direct, relevant experience raising a specific concern deserves considerably more weight than a distant relative whose doubt stems mainly from your path simply being unfamiliar to them. Consider, second, the specificity. Is the feedback specific and actionable, pointing toward a particular identifiable problem you could potentially address? Or is it vague and general, more a diffuse expression of discomfort than an actual identifiable concern? Specific, actionable concerns deserve more serious engagement than vague, general skepticism. Consider, third, your own honest internal reaction. Does the feedback, when you sit with it honestly, rather than defensively, actually resonate with something you may have sensed yourself, but hadn't fully acknowledged? Or does it feel, upon honest reflection, genuinely disconnected from your own actual experience of the situation? Rosalind, once she recognized her mistake, developed a specific practice worth carrying forward directly, whenever significant feedback or doubt arrived. Rather than immediately sorting it into either category by reflex, she began deliberately pausing to ask herself these specific questions before responding, considering the source's actual expertise, the specificity of the concern, and her own honest internal reaction, rather than defaulting automatically to the dismissive stance that had served her well with unproductive skeptics but had, in this instance, caused her to miss genuinely important information. I want to name something important about why this distinction is so easy to blur, because understanding the psychological mechanism helps you catch yourself making this mistake before it costs you something significant. Once you've built genuine confidence in setting aside unproductive doubt, there's a real, understandable temptation to extend that same confident dismissal to all input, because dismissal, once practiced and reinforced, becomes psychologically easier and more comfortable than the harder, more effortful work of actually discerning, case by case, which category a given piece of feedback actually belongs to. This is worth naming directly. The skill this journey has been building can become, if applied carelessly, a convenient shield against ever having to seriously reconsider your approach, which is precisely the opposite of what genuine confidence and genuine growth actually require. There's an important related distinction worth drawing here, one that connects back to ideas explored in an earlier journey about the difference between genuine caution and old fear disguised as caution. Just as that earlier journey explored learning to distinguish your own internal voice of genuine wisdom from disguised fear, this chapter is asking you to build a similar discernment about external voices, learning to distinguish genuine expertise-based concern from disguised discomfort with unfamiliarity, rather than applying a single blanket response to every voice that happens to express doubt or concern about your chosen path. I want to offer something important about how Rosalind actually rebuilt her relationship with feedback after this specific, costly mistake, because the corrective itself is worth understanding clearly. She didn't swing back to the opposite extreme, treating every piece of criticism with excessive, anxious deference that would simply replace one unhelpful, blanket response with another. Instead, she built a more effortful, more genuinely discerning practice, taking a beat before responding to any significant piece of feedback, applying the specific markers described above, and only then deciding, deliberately and case by case, whether the input deserved serious engagement and potential course correction, or whether it belonged, genuinely, to the category of unproductive doubt this journey has spent so much time addressing. Here is what I want you to carry forward from this chapter, because it corrects and refines everything explored earlier in this journey. The practice of not explaining yourself to unmoved skeptics was never meant to become a blanket dismissal of all external input. It requires ongoing, case-by-case discernment, considering the source's genuine expertise, the specificity of the concern, and your own honest internal reaction, rather than a single, comfortable, reflexive response applied indiscriminately to anything that sounds, on the surface, like doubt. Genuine confidence, the kind this entire journey has been building toward, includes the humility to recognize when a piece of feedback actually deserves serious engagement, even when it arrives sounding, superficially, like the same unproductive doubt you've correctly learned to set aside in other contexts. In the next chapter, we're going to look at something that becomes especially relevant once you've built this more refined discernment: how to actually choose, deliberately, which few people in your life deserve a genuine explanation of your reasoning, even while the broader practice of not explaining yourself to unmoved skeptics remains largely in place. Chapter 10: Choosing who actually deserves an explanation. There is a specific, important refinement worth adding to everything explored so far in this journey, because the practice of not explaining yourself to persistent, unmoved skeptics could easily be misunderstood as a call toward complete, undifferentiated silence with everyone in your life. That was never the actual intention, and this chapter exists specifically to correct that potential misunderstanding. There remain a small number of people in most people's lives who genuinely do deserve real, thoughtful explanation, and learning to identify exactly who belongs in this small, deliberately chosen circle is just as important a skill as learning to withhold explanation from everyone else. Let's understand why this distinction matters so much, because it prevents this entire journey from tipping into something that would genuinely damage your most important relationships. The practices explored throughout this journey have specifically addressed situations where explanation isn't actually working: persistent doubt rooted in something words can't touch, casual or distant skeptics whose opinion, while sometimes uncomfortable to sit with, doesn't require the kind of deep, ongoing relational investment that closer relationships genuinely deserve. But there's a meaningful difference between a distant colleague's unmoved skepticism and the genuine, good faith questions of someone who loves you, has real relevant context, and is asking not to challenge or doubt you, but genuinely to understand you better in order to support you more effectively. Let me tell you about a man named Ezekiel, whose experience illustrates why this distinction matters in practice. Ezekiel had, over several years, built real skill in the practices this journey has explored, protecting his energy from unproductive explanation, letting his results accumulate and speak for themselves, rather than constantly defending his choices to skeptics. This skill served him well in many areas of his life, but he noticed, at a certain point, that he had begun applying this same withholding stance even with a small handful of people who had never actually been unmoved skeptics at all, people who had, in fact, consistently shown genuine, good faith curiosity and support, and who had simply, reasonably, wanted to understand more about significant decisions Ezekiel was making, precisely because they cared about him and wanted to support him well. This overcorrection, once Ezekiel recognized it, revealed something important worth naming directly: the discipline of not over-explaining, practiced without careful discernment about audience, can drift into a kind of generalized emotional guardedness that costs you exactly the genuine intimacy and support that close, trusted relationships are meant to provide. Ezekiel's closest friend, someone who had never once expressed the kind of unmoved, persistent doubt this journey has been addressing, found herself increasingly shut out of Ezekiel's actual reasoning and inner life, not because she had done anything to deserve that distance, but because Ezekiel, having built real skill in withholding explanation from unproductive skeptics, had begun applying that same withholding reflexively, without actually distinguishing her genuine, supportive curiosity from the very different dynamic this journey has spent so much time addressing. This is worth understanding as a genuinely important corrective, because it points toward a skill this journey hasn't yet explicitly named. Actively, deliberately choosing a small circle of people who do genuinely deserve full, honest explanation of your reasoning, not because they've proven their doubt will eventually be resolved by good arguments, but because their relationship with you is built on a foundation of genuine trust and goodwill that makes real, honest communication both possible and valuable, in a way it simply isn't with the more casual or persistently skeptical relationships this journey has primarily addressed. I want to offer some specific markers worth using to identify who belongs in this deliberately chosen circle, because choose wisely isn't useful without more concrete guidance. Consider, first, their track record. Has this person, across your actual history with them, generally responded to your honest explanations with genuine consideration, even when they've disagreed? Or have they consistently responded to explanation with continued, unmoved skepticism, regardless of what you've offered them? The first pattern suggests someone worth continuing to invest real explanation in. The second pattern suggests someone who belongs in the category this journey has spent most of its chapters addressing. Consider, second, their motivation. Does this person's curiosity about your reasoning seem to come from a genuine desire to understand and support you? Or does it seem to come from a need to be reassured that you're making the right choice by their own standards? The first motivation deserves real engagement. The second, however lovingly intended, often functions more like the identity threat or comfort-based doubt explored earlier in this journey, and tends not to be resolved through explanation, regardless of how genuine the underlying love actually is. Ezekiel, once he recognized this important distinction, made a deliberate, conscious effort to identify the small handful of people in his life who genuinely belonged in this trusted circle: his closest friend, one particular family member who had consistently shown good faith curiosity rather than unmoved doubt, a mentor whose questions had always been aimed at genuinely understanding and helping him rather than expressing skepticism about his fundamental judgment. With this small, deliberately identified group, Ezekiel made a conscious choice to remain genuinely open and communicative, sharing his actual reasoning, engaging honestly with their genuine questions, allowing real vulnerability and real explanation to exist in these specific relationships, even while maintaining the more protective, results-focused stance with the broader world of casual acquaintances and persistent, unproductive skeptics. This distinction produced something important, worth naming directly. Ezekiel's relationships with his genuinely trusted circle actually deepened once he began consciously, deliberately offering them the kind of honest explanation and vulnerability he'd been reflexively withholding from everyone. And simultaneously, his energy remained genuinely protected from the unproductive, exhausting battles with persistent skeptics that this journey has spent so much time addressing. He wasn't choosing between complete openness and complete withholding. He was choosing, deliberately and with real discernment, exactly where each stance actually served him and his relationships well. I want to name something important about why this deliberate circle matters so much, beyond simply the relational benefit of maintaining genuine intimacy with people who deserve it. This small, trusted circle also serves a genuinely practical function this journey hasn't yet explicitly addressed. They can serve as a kind of honest external check on your own judgment, precisely the kind of grounded perspective explored in an earlier chapter about navigating periods of accumulated internal doubt and exhaustion. If everyone in your life has been placed indiscriminately into the category of people you no longer explain yourself to, you lose access to exactly the kind of genuine, trusted feedback that could help you distinguish, as explored in the previous chapter, between unproductive doubt worth setting aside and genuinely useful concern worth taking seriously. A deliberately maintained circle of trusted, honest relationships gives you somewhere to actually test your own reasoning against genuine, good faith perspective, rather than facing every difficult decision in complete isolation, protected from all input, including the input that might genuinely help you. There's a practical exercise worth carrying forward from Ezekiel's experience, one you can use to identify your own trusted circle honestly. Think through the people currently in your life who regularly express curiosity, concern, or questions about significant choices you're making. For each one, ask yourself honestly, across our actual history together, has explaining myself to this person generally led to genuine understanding and continued support, even when we've disagreed? Or has it generally led to the same unmoved, persistent doubt, regardless of what I've explained? The people who fall clearly into the first category deserve your continued, genuine openness, worth actively protecting and investing in, even as you apply the more protective practices explored throughout this journey to everyone else. I want to close this chapter with something important about balance, because this entire journey, taken as a whole, is ultimately about exactly this kind of discernment, rather than any single, blanket rule applied indiscriminately to every relationship and every situation. The goal was never complete silence with everyone, and it was never complete, unguarded openness with everyone either. The goal, consistently, has been learning to distinguish accurately between doubt that's rooted in something explanation can't touch, and doubt that genuinely can be resolved through honest communication, between relationships built on unmoved skepticism and relationships built on genuine trust and goodwill, between feedback worth taking seriously and doubt worth setting aside. This discernment, built carefully and applied thoughtfully, rather than as a single rigid rule, is what actually produces both the protected energy this journey has been building toward and the genuine, intact relationships that make a protected, focused life actually worth living. Here is what I want you to carry forward from this chapter. Identify, deliberately and honestly, the small circle of people in your life who have consistently shown genuine goodwill and good faith curiosity, rather than unmoved, persistent doubt, and protect your openness and honest explanation specifically for them, even as you apply the broader practices of this journey to the wider world of casual skeptics and unproductive doubt. This deliberate circle is not a contradiction of everything explored so far. It's the necessary, careful refinement that keeps the entire practice from tipping into a kind of guarded isolation that would ultimately cost you far more than it protects. In the next chapter, we're going to look at something that becomes especially important once you've built this refined discernment: how to actually maintain your own internal peace and stability while living, day to day, alongside people who continue, despite everything, to doubt you. Chapter 11. Living peacefully alongside ongoing doubt. There is a specific, practical reality worth naming honestly at this point in the journey. For many people, the doubt explored throughout this journey doesn't simply resolve and disappear after a defined period of patient building. Sometimes, particular doubters remain unconvinced indefinitely, woven permanently into the fabric of your ongoing life. A family member who will likely never fully embrace your chosen path. A colleague whose skepticism seems destined to persist, regardless of how many results accumulate. A corner of your world that will probably continue holding doubt about you for as long as you know each other. I want to address this directly, because everything explored so far in this journey has, understandably, focused considerable attention on the eventual softening of doubt, the eventual moment of vindication, the gradual process by which accumulated results wear down even persistent skepticism. But honesty requires acknowledging that this eventual softening doesn't always arrive, at least not completely, and this chapter is specifically about what it actually looks like to build a genuinely peaceful, sustainable life alongside doubt that simply persists, indefinitely, as one ongoing feature of your world, rather than a problem eventually, fully solved. Let me tell you about a woman named Ginevra, whose experience illustrates what this ongoing peaceful coexistence can actually look like in practice. Ginevra had a specific relative, an aunt who had remained consistently skeptical of a significant life choice Ginevra had made for well over a decade, entirely unmoved by years of accumulated results that had genuinely, visibly succeeded by any reasonable external measure. Unlike many of the stories explored earlier in this journey, Ginevra's aunt never really softened. The doubt simply remained, a permanent, if relatively minor, feature of an otherwise warm and important family relationship. For years, Ginevra found this persistence genuinely difficult to accept, precisely because it violated the implicit promise many people absorb from stories about eventually earning skeptics' respect through sustained, visible success. The quiet expectation that if you simply build enough, wait long enough, the doubt will eventually, inevitably, dissolve. When Ginevra's aunt remained unmoved even after years of clear, undeniable success, Ginevra experienced a specific, additional layer of frustration on top of the original discomfort of being doubted, a frustration rooted in the failure of an expectation she hadn't fully realized she'd been quietly holding. What eventually helped Ginevra build genuine peace with this specific, ongoing situation was a reframe worth naming directly, because it applies to anyone facing a similarly persistent, unresolved doubt in their own life. She came to accept, honestly, that some people's doubt is not actually about evidence at all, in a way that goes even deeper than the identity threat or comfort-based doubt explored earlier in this journey. For some people, doubt about a particular person or a particular choice becomes so woven into their own long-standing self-concept, their own settled narrative about how the world works, that no accumulation of evidence, however undeniable, will ever fully dislodge it. Not because they're being deliberately unreasonable, but because the doubt has become, for them, less a conclusion drawn from evidence and more a permanent, largely unconscious feature of how they've organized their own understanding of you and your choices. This might sound, on its surface, like a discouraging thing to accept, but Ginevra found, somewhat to her own surprise, that genuinely accepting this possibility, rather than continuing to hold out hope for an eventual softening that might never fully arrive, actually produced considerable relief. As long as she was quietly waiting for her aunt's doubt to eventually dissolve, every family interaction carried a faint, background tension, a small, persistent hope for vindication that hadn't yet arrived, coloring the relationship with a subtle expectation that colored even genuinely pleasant moments together. Once Ginevra genuinely released that expectation, accepting honestly that her aunt's doubt might simply remain a permanent feature of their relationship, regardless of anything Ginevra ever did or achieved, something important shifted. She was able to be present with her aunt, in their otherwise warm and genuine relationship, without the subtle background tension of continuing to hope for a vindication that she'd finally, honestly, stopped expecting. This is worth understanding as a distinct and important skill, separate from everything explored earlier in this journey, about patient building and eventual vindication, the capacity to genuinely release the expectation of eventual resolution, while still maintaining a warm, functional relationship with someone whose doubt simply persists. This is different from bitterness, and it's different from continued quiet hope disguised as acceptance. It's a genuine, settled release, arriving at a place where you no longer need this particular person's belief in order to feel complete in your own sense of your accomplishments, and where their continued doubt, while perhaps still mildly disappointing in quiet moments, no longer carries the active, ongoing weight of an unresolved hope you're still, quietly, holding on to. I want to offer something important about how Ginevra actually built this genuine release, because just accept it is easier to say than to actually practice. She found it helpful to distinguish clearly, in her own mind, between two different sources of validation for her accomplishments: the external, social kind, which will always remain, to some degree, outside her control and dependent on other people's willingness to update their views, and the internal, private kind, built through her own honest, ongoing assessment of her own work and choices, entirely independent of any particular person's opinion. She had, by this point in her journey, built genuine strength in this second, internal source, enough that her aunt's persistent doubt, while still occasionally touching something tender, no longer threatened her fundamental sense of her own accomplishment and worth. There's a specific practice worth carrying forward from Ginevra's experience, one you can use with any similarly persistent, seemingly permanent doubter in your own life. Rather than continuing to hold, even quietly and unconsciously, an ongoing hope for eventual vindication, try consciously, deliberately releasing that specific expectation, not through bitterness or resignation, but through a genuine, settled acceptance that this particular person's doubt may simply remain a permanent feature of your relationship, regardless of anything you continue to build or achieve. Ask yourself honestly, if this person never fully comes around, would my own sense of my accomplishments still feel complete and sufficient? If the honest answer is yes, you've likely already built the internal foundation this release actually requires. If the honest answer reveals genuine, ongoing dependency on this person's eventual approval, that dependency itself is worth examining honestly, using the practices explored throughout earlier chapters of this journey. I want to name something important about what becomes possible once this genuine release is achieved, because it changes the actual texture of ongoing relationships with persistent doubters in a way worth understanding clearly. Ginevra's relationship with her aunt, once she'd genuinely released the expectation of eventual vindication, actually became warmer and more relaxed than it had been during the years she'd still been quietly hoping for a change of heart. Freed from the subtle tension of unmet expectation, she found herself able to simply enjoy her aunt's company in the many dimensions of their relationship, unrelated to the specific point of disagreement, much the way Percival, in an earlier chapter of this journey, learned to maintain genuine warmth with his father, even while a specific disagreement remained unresolved between them. I want to be honest about something important as this chapter closes, because it deserves acknowledgement rather than being smoothed over. Genuinely releasing the hope for a particular person's eventual approval, when that hope has been present for a long time, is genuinely difficult, and it may not happen all at once through a single moment of decision. Ginevra described this release as something that deepened gradually, over a period of continued practice and continued honest reflection, rather than something she simply decided one day and then fully, permanently achieved. This is, once again, consistent with everything this journey has explored about genuine psychological change, gradual, practiced, and rarely as instant or dramatic as we might wish it to be. Here is what I want you to carry forward from this chapter. Not all doubt resolves, even with patient building and genuinely excellent results. And building a genuinely peaceful life requires more than simply waiting for that resolution to eventually arrive. It requires, for the doubt that genuinely persists, a deliberate, honest release of the expectation that vindication is still coming, replaced by a settled, internal sense of your own accomplishment that no longer depends on any particular person's eventual agreement. This release, difficult and gradual as it is to build, allows you to maintain genuine warmth in relationships where full external validation may never fully arrive. freeing you to actually enjoy those relationships in every dimension that doesn't depend on a resolution you finally, honestly, stopped waiting for.